All right, thanks to the worship team doing a great job this morning. Do appreciate it. La Belle Vie is a coffee shop I frequent up in St. Charles in Frenchtown right off the river. And they posted this morning that they're going to be closing at 3 o'clock today so their employees can go home and enjoy the Super Bowl. And they said, just so you know, we don't care which team wins the Super Bowl as long as the Rams lose. I think that sentiment might be shared here. I just had to guess. And so that sounds good to me. Abraham Lincoln is once quoted as saying, and I should always pause right there before you actually quote somebody, because a lot of historical figures are attributed quotes that they never said. But in this particular case, I think it's fairly accurate from what I gather. But he was once asked the question as they were approaching going into the Civil War, do you think God is on your side? And Abraham Lincoln said, sir, it does not, I do not, the main priority is not that God is on my side, but that I am on God's side. For God is always right. And I thought a lot about that quote this week, and that's something that just kind of resonated in my head again and again. The concern isn't if God is going to follow my will, my direction, what I'm doing. My bigger concern is centering myself on Him and what He wants for me. And that is a backwards thought in today's culture, in today's world. So many people base their life, their choices, everything they do on what they want first and on what God wants second, third, or even not at all. The question becomes, when we do make decisions, is it truly on what God has in store for us? Or is it on the shifting sands of culture? Because the world is always shifting the standard of what we should do and should not do. The culture is always trying to move us one direction or the other. And for too many Christians, they don't have a standard of right and wrong anymore. Their idea of right and wrong shifts along with the world. A.T. Pierson once used this illustration that I think paints a picture very well for us. And that is, imagine a man was selling you a farm that had 1,000 acres. And the only catch was, in the very middle, he was going to keep 1 square acre with his house on it. Everything else was yours. He's going to sell you 999 acres. And you agreed to buy it. According to most state laws, if you buy a piece of land that is landlocked, you have to provide an access road so the owner of that land can get there. And so it is in our life. When we do not give God 100% of our lives, 100% of our decisions, 100% of our morality, that we give the devil an access road into our lives. Even if you give God 999, when you leave 1 acre open, you give the devil an opportunity. I think it's Peter who described it as giving the devil a foothold. Whenever you don't commit in the entirety of your life to Jesus, in every decision you make, you are leaving an opportunity for the devil to persuade you to make a bad decision. Last week we talked about how one of the culture's greatest weapons against us is confusion. But today it is culture's attempt to make us compromise. When we are confused, we are then more likely to compromise. And this is a series we've been going through the book of Daniel the last 3 weeks. We're still in the first chapter as we're starting to understand the attack that was put on Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is similar attacks that are put on to us today. We live in a world that is constantly wanting us to compromise our values, our standard of right and wrong, or should I say God's standard of right and wrong. And unless we build on the solid foundation of Jesus, we will be persuaded to compromise things that we know to be true. We live in a culture that will constantly grind against us. It won't quit. Even if we stand firm for years, the culture's not going to say, well, I guess we should leave them alone. No, they're going to keep sliding farther and farther away. And it is our responsibility to stand firm. We live in a culture that wants us to compromise. And here's how we see it begin in Daniel. We're talking about a buffet in Babylon. Daniel chapter 1, verse 5. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. Now that doesn't sound too bad when you first read it. Okay, you're going to be a slave if you're going to be a slave, this may be the best way to do it. You're getting food from the king's table. Well, you know the king's not eating the worst food. He's going to eat the best tasting food. So that seems reasonable. And you're getting a 3-year training service. At least you're going to be educated. I mean, there could be worse things in the world. If you're going to be a slave, this might be the best of all worlds. But there's a problem with this diet that Daniel and the others are provided. One is, most likely, we don't know this to be 100% true, but it's a safe assumption, a lot of that food would have been sacrificed to idols. It would have been used in pagan worship. And so by eating that meal, it was assumed that you were performing worship to that God. Now we know when we get to the New Testament that we read about food sacrificed to idols and that it's a personal matter. If it doesn't bother your conscience and you know you're not worshiping that idol, you're good. But if it does bother your conscience, you need to avoid it because it becomes a sin issue for you. Well, in Daniel's case, this was a sin issue for him. This was going to put a barrier between him and the one true God, and he didn't want to do that. He did not want to participate in this buffet. And so, because it was probably used in idolatry practices, he didn't want it. Also, maybe it was just the wrong dietary food. You know, the Israelites in the Old Testament had a very specific set of dietary laws on what they could and could not eat. I imagine Israel's diet was different from Babylon. Babylon was 700 miles away from Jerusalem. Different climate, different culture, different background, probably different foods that were eaten on a regular basis. Many that might have been considered unclean. It's also possible, maybe this just wasn't the right food for Daniel. Maybe he would have looked at it and said, you know what, that's not going to sit well with me. You know, if I invite you over for a particular food and you know that food's not going to sit well with you, you're probably going to pass. Like, no thanks. So whatever the case is, Daniel knew that this was not right. And what happens is the world continually offers us a buffet of bad choices. Here's how Daniel stood up to it in Daniel chapter 1, verse 8. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. We opened up with that song, I am resolved no longer to linger, torn by the world's delights. At some point, we have to be resolved. We have to make a firm decision that I'm not going to go down this road. And Daniel resolved that this is not what I'm going to do. Now think about it though. If you're Daniel, you're a slave, you get brought in, and at least you're getting the best job of the slaves, I would say. Is the first thing you want to do rock the boat? Hey, we're going to give you food from the king's table. You think all the slaves are getting that kind of treatment? No, they're getting the trash and the leftovers. They'll be malnourished and dead within 5 years. But Daniel and them were going through a particular training program to be useful for many years. In fact, Daniel would live 70 years in Babylon. So, at some point his nutrition was very well taken care of. Yet, the first thing he does is rock the boat. And he doesn't do it to be obnoxious or to be a jerk. He does it to stand firm to honor God. When we are offered a buffet in Babylon, that's exactly what we have to do. We can't afford to hesitate. Because Daniel doesn't say, well, guys, what do you think? Maybe we should eat the meal this time and see how it sits. And if it feels wrong or it doesn't feel right, then maybe we can go talk to them and see if they change their mind and give us something different. But he didn't do that. Daniel stood firm from the beginning. Before he ever considered eating the food, he had already determined he would not eat anything unclean. He would not eat anything sacrificed to an idol. This would not be something that would enter his body. And this is the point. We need to decide before the dilemma. We need to decide before we're faced with the challenge. Too many Christians wander into situations and they don't know how to deal with it. Well, the answer is pretty obvious if you go to God's Word, but because they haven't made that the foundation of their life, they don't know how to decide in the moment. And when you are forced to make a decision in the moment, you almost always choose wrong. You choose what is easiest, what is most convenient, the path of least resistance. And that is often opposed to what God wants us to do in our life. When you look at what was going on with Daniel and his 3 friends and all the others that were taken into captivity, they were taken in and they were going through an identity change, a transformation. Their Jewish heritage and character was being completely done away with. And because they had decided to honor God with their lives before they ever set foot as being a slave, they had already decided that they would not compromise their integrity. They would not compromise their relationship with God to fit into the Babylonian culture. Now, the problem is we have a culture that is constantly compromising our beliefs by shifting the standards of what we tolerate. And this is becoming a real issue for Christians today. Because I think a lot of Christians have shifted the standard of their own thing, of the things that they tolerate as well. Best example I could think of as I was going over the past couple weeks preparing for this is TV. You know, when I was growing up, I watched TV Land with I Love Lucy. Everybody watched I Love Lucy? A lot of people? Okay. The rest of you need to get TV Land. But TV Land had I Love Lucy, Andy Griffith Show, all the shows. But on I Love Lucy, when Ricky and Lucy were first on the show, you might recall that they slept in separate beds. And so it was almost humorous to the point because they were married in real life. At that time, they were anyway. And so because they were married in real life, it would seem to make sense. But because they did not want to display a man and woman in bed together, they displayed them in separate beds. And it wasn't until after little Ricky came along that they were in the same bed. I think there's a timeline issue with that. But I digress. And so anyway, that's the way they portrayed it on TV, though. They just did not want to go down that road of portraying some sort of sexuality on TV, and so they had husbands and wives in separate beds. Actually, before I Love Lucy, I think this goes back to the 50s, whenever they would film a man and woman that might be in bed, they each put one foot on the floor. And so you actually could see on TV that there was a foot of either of them on the floor on the opposite side to show that they were not near each other. Have you turned on the TV recently? I think culture has shifted the standard of what is acceptable on TV. You know, what used to be probably a premium pay-per-view channel show is now on Netflix. It's on Hulu. It might even be on the local channels at certain times. There's sometimes I see something on TV, I'm like, what is this rated? What would have been rated XXX a few years ago is now rated TV-14. Or maybe MA if they're daring it that much. It has shifted completely. Now, my concern isn't so much what culture tolerates on TV, because it's never going to improve. It's only going to get worse. Here's the real question. What are you willing to watch on TV today? And let me take it a step further. Are you watching stuff on TV today that you would have dared not watch 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago? Are you tolerating shows with language and sexuality and depictions of particular relationships or morality or lack thereof that you would have not touched 20 years ago and 30 years ago? If so, it's not the shifting culture that's changed, that's always changing. It's our standard that has changed. And that is the problem. Culture will always shift and change. That's the nature of human history. Study any rise and fall of any empire that the world has ever known. They always change. It's what they do. But for the Christian, there should be a standard of right and wrong that is followed. Now, I'm not here to be legalistic with you and say you can't watch this show because it uses, the F word. You can't watch this show because it showed this particular type of sexuality. Some of that is subjective. Some of that you need to determine if it's going to lead you down a negative path. But we do have to be a little bit more, I think, honest with ourselves if this is healthy or good for us to ingest. It goes back to the 90s. You know what was real popular when people wore those bracelets, WWJD, what would Jesus do? And I'm not saying this to shame anyone or whatever, but if Jesus literally was walking with you and sitting with you on the couch as you put on the show, would you feel comfortable with it on the TV? Here's the little side detail. He knows. Just because you can't see him, he knows he's there. And that's a filter that might do us some good to be more intentionally aware of it. The NFL had a slogan for the last several years called the No Fun League, because they find everybody for celebrating touchdowns and doing all the things. They've tried to pull back on that. And I know this can sound like the No Fun Church League right now. Like, oh my goodness, we can't do anything great. Are you living for a temporary world, or are you living for an eternal kingdom? Are you living for something that will last forever, or are you trying to find a momentary pleasure that is fleeting? Jesus died so that we can take hold of something that will last forever, and it's time we start living like it. The problem is, it's not just individuals, it's churches that have also began to slip with the culture. Now, I used this illustration probably 10 years ago. Dad and I used it, he was still preaching, and it was, I think, a great illustration then to depict how this has gone on, and we're going to use it again today. So I'm gonna need Dad to come up here. So Dad, if you can make your way up here, I would appreciate it. Zach and Greg, if you could also come up here, I would appreciate that as well. This is going to go well, I think. And
don't count on it.
Yeah. And Joe, actually, why don't you come up here too? That'd be great. So,
Gotcha.
if you haven't had a chance to meet Joe, this is Joe. Everybody say hi, Joe. Hi, Joe. Excellent. Very good. If you're scared of stages, I'm so sorry. But, okay, very good. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to have different people up here represent different people. We need one of these people to represent Jesus. Who should that be?
Steve.
All right, Dad. Come here, Jesus. It's fair. You have so much of the Bible memorized, you might as well. So, no.
That doesn't make me like Jesus.
You
You know me too well.
No, you're good. You're good. All right, one of these guys needs to represent the world. Greg, Greg, you come here and be the world. We need one of you to represent the church.
Sure.
All right, sure. Joe, you're going to be the devil. So come on here. Oh, and brighten up the stage. Would you open up the lights? Very good. So let's, sorry, worship team, we're going to do a little rearranging here. All right, so Satan, come here. Thank you. I mean that in love. Love, as Coach talked about this morning. Very good. Okay, so what we have here, we have ourselves Jesus, and we have ourselves Satan, and you're the church, and you're the world. So let's swap places. Actually, church, just go and go back against the wall for now. That's fine. All right. All right, so if standing close to Jesus is as close as we can get to righteousness, and standing next to Satan is as close as we can get to pure evil, where should we place the world today? Which way do we need to go? Point. Let's see. Hands moving. All right. Everybody agrees that we need to get closer to Joe. So let's get closer to Joe. All right. Should we get now? Good or farther?
Farther.
Oh, we want people getting farther. Okay. All right. How about now? Oh, we got some people. Okay. Now wait a minute. Wait a minute. Wait a minute. I agree. The world's a mess.
No.
I mean, the world's a mess. Okay. But listen. While the world's a mess, I mean, there are some really good things in the world. There are churches that are still out there preaching good news. The Salvation Army is out there still helping those who are struggling. There are good deeds being done by people, neighbors who love each other. There are still good things in the world today. So I think there's still some distance to go. I think this is good. I think that's good. But now let's bring the church into this equation. Where is the church? In America, we're talking specifically in America. Where's the church on this? So let's start you right here. Where do we want him to go?
Towards Greg.
Oh, towards Greg. Okay. How about now?
Further.
Further. I heard a good and I heard a further. I see some pointing. All right, take it a little more. All right. How about now? Some people want. Okay.
I think they're touching.
Oh,
I'm feeling real lonely over here.
yeah, you're feeling lonely. Yeah. Okay. So what has happened, though, is there has been a shift, a change in not only the church, but I think there's been a shift and change in the world. So let's, the world and the church, step over this way. Let's say the 1960s, 1950s represents where the church was in America and where the world was in America. Ricky and Lucy, separate beds, husbands, wives, foot on the floor. We're not going to tolerate that on TV. But then things began to change. You know, you had, Three's Company show up, and every innuendo the world had to offer, and so the world took a step. And then, you know, the one show that was banned in our household was The Simpsons. That was a big no-no. And so, still is a no-no, yeah. I've yet to see a full episode. So we're going to take so the world took a step, and then, you know, the Osbournes showed up, and so then we took another step, and then Family Guy showed up, and we took another step, and then, I don't know, what's a bad show? You don't know any bad shows. Okay, so there another bad show. I don't know. Something bad. Okay, so the world has just kept moving along, and TV's the best gauge for it that I can come up with. I mean, you see how it's changed. Music would also be appropriate. Anything else? The thing is, the church has not stayed stationary during that time. It is my personal belief that getting you some exercise. Yes. All right, so put your hand on it. Instead of anchoring to Jesus, step over. No, kidding. Instead of anchoring to Jesus, what the church has done is they've anchored themselves to the world. And all the church has tried to do is say, well, we're not as bad as the world. And so as the world takes a step, the church takes a step. And as the world gets into the 80s with those shows, the church takes a step. And the world takes a step, and the church takes a step. And it is my opinion, this is just my opinion, but it is my opinion that the church tolerates things today that the world wanted nothing to do with 40 years ago.
Right.
And that's not because Jesus has changed. Last time I checked, it says God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. It's because the standards of the world have been standards of the church have been anchored to the world instead of to the unchanging power of Jesus. Now listen, if we were doing this right and the church got anchored to Jesus, the world would start off closer, but then the world takes a step. And pretty soon, the church won't be able to reach the world. And the world's going to say, hey, you need to get in line and get over here. But because the church is anchored to Jesus, the church says, no, I'm not going to do that. And so the world says, well, you're mean. You're closed-minded. You're a bigot. You're homophobic. You're racist. You're every other ism I can come up with. And the world keeps stepping away. And the gap between the church and the world widens. And look, the book of Revelation does tell the future. It does tell things to come. Some believe some events have already happened here or there. It doesn't really matter at the end of the day. But what it does say is the world will one day get so angry at the church because the gap is so wide that they'll say, let's kill them, and then they'll celebrate it in chapters 10 and 11. It's ugly. It's painful. But when we stay anchored to Jesus, that's the ultimate reality. But is it worth compromising our relationship with Jesus just so the world likes us? Because guess what? The world's not going to like you long because the world's going to keep going that way. If the world was eventually going to go this way, it wouldn't end with the destruction of the world at the end of Revelation. But the world is done away with at the end of Revelation chapter 20 because the world will ultimately make its way all the way over to Satan. It is the church's job not to see how close we can get and still be better than the world. It's to stay as close as we can to Jesus. And yes, that means we endure hardship, we endure pain, we endure criticisms that are unjust and unfounded. But we are not here to win a popularity contest. We are here to stay faithful to the one who died for us. That is what it ultimately comes down to. Guys, you can have a seat. Thanks for being up here. I appreciate it. We will constantly compromise our beliefs. We will constantly compromise what we stand for if we don't decide before we're faced with the dilemma. And somewhere along the line, the church said, we need to be relevant. We need to fit in. We need to make things work. I was talking to a friend this week, and he says, you know one thing that really bugs me about my church? I'm like, well, what? He goes, we play secular music before the service begins. So country songs or whatever. Nothing with inappropriate lyrics, of course. But they want to just fit in. They want to fit into their culture, and so they play it. And I don't care if a church plays that before service or not. It may not be my personal taste. He goes, that just bothers me. He goes, because the church should be the one place where you get so connected to God, and yet we're trying to act like we fit in with the world. We like, Garth Brooks or whoever it is. I'm sure most of his songs aren't appropriate. But no, we like all these songs like everybody else. We're working so hard to fit in that we're taking steps away from Jesus, and maybe we're totally unaware. Here's the problem. If we don't decide before we face the dilemma, if we don't decide before we go into the challenge and the situation, we will start looking at challenges as gifts from God. We will start looking at temptations from the devil as things that we want and we think it's from God. True story. I talked to someone very recently who, she's divorced, 4 kids, going through a challenging situation in life, wanted to talk, so we visited and started getting into a relationship with someone. God brought him in at this right time. It's been great. And then I found out he's still married. I kept hearing, but God brought him in. I don't know why God would do this. Quit giving God credit for leading you into a sinful relationship. Because God doesn't work that way. But because we have not decided before the dilemma, because we are not completely anchored in Christ, we get confused, and therefore we compromise. We can't afford to compromise anymore. The enemy is deceptive. Have you not read the scriptures? It's his skill set he is always deceiving. It goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 3, and it's been going on ever since. He's been pretty good at it. He's not changing tactics now. This is why you need to know what you stand for before you ever face the challenges. Psalm 119 verse 112 says, "My heart is set on keeping your decrees to the very end." My heart is set on keeping your decrees to the very end. Can you say that? Can you say that I'm not going to compromise whether it makes me unpopular, or whether it brings personal pain, or whether that means a break in relationships, or whether that means potential death? In our culture, we're not there yet. But if things keep trending, the persecution against Christians is only going to increase. Ultimately, we are responsible for what we hold closely to our hearts. We are responsible for what foundation we are building on. And are we building on God's foundation or man's foundation? Because culture is like building on the sand. When the storms hit, it's going to collapse. But if you'll build on the firm foundation of Jesus Christ, it says it will withstand the storms life will throw your way. Ultimately, this might come down to core convictions. Okay, if you're going to decide before the dilemma, you need to decide what it is you are convicted about in your life. And this is not to draw a line in the sand and tell the world, I'm not going to be like you. I'm going to be so different from you, and I'm going to make you feel bad for being different. That's not why we have core convictions. We have core convictions so when the world is hurting, they can see the difference. I forget who it was who said it. I know Bob Russell said it in a sermon. He was quoting an author, and the author said that he believed that for every non-Christian who gets cancer, a Christian gets cancer, so the world can see the difference. The world looks at us and say, you're not grieving like everyone else. You have joy even though you've lost a loved one. You have a reason to celebrate even though we're hurting and feel lost. What's different about you? Jesus is what is different. And that core conviction is a light to a lost world. There are many people who will still be saved and brought into the kingdom through the work of the church, and it is our responsibility to be that positive influence today. What we have to realize is the shifting sands of the culture and the shifting sand that can be the foundation of the church happens because we have different life experiences. All of your life experiences shape your worldview, and that's why we come to different conclusions. That's why we argue and we disagree. If we all went through the exact same thing, the exact same way, and had the exact same feelings about it, there would be nothing to disagree on. But think about it like this. I'm going to use something that's been discussed in our country for many years now. I'm not promoting one opinion or the other, but this, I think, will explain it well for you. There's been a big argument in our country about universal health care for quite a while. And should that be something we have or not? Now, I don't care what your opinion is, and I don't want to hear your opinion, so after church, don't tell me your opinion. Keep it to yourself. I'm just saying it's becoming an arguing point for people. And there's been a big push one way or the other. What makes someone stand one way or the other? Well, I found in my own experiences, talking to people who've had a job that's provided good insurance, that they've never had that issue, that they've always had the coverage they needed, they're like, well, this is something we don't need to support. You need to get a good job, and that's going to take care of it. But then I've talked to other people who support it, and it's been themselves or a family member, a loved one, who didn't have the insurance they needed. They didn't have the job that provided the benefit. They were left with thousands of dollars of medical bills or didn't get the proper and adequate coverage. And they look at them with sympathy and they say, we need to help them. We need to do something for them. Now, the conviction is a result of the life experience. And so when you ask yourself, why am I for something? Why am I against something? It does you well to visit back in your mind as to why it is, what situations you've gone through that have led you to the conclusion you're in. And so you can't ingest anything in your life that does not affect your moral convictions, your core convictions. You can't watch a show, a movie. You can't listen to music. You can't have friends and family members that you talk to on a regular basis. You can't go through experiences in life without them leaving some kind of impact about what you believe. And it is so important that we have that core conviction that we are going to honor Jesus first and foremost. George Barna did a study. This goes back to 2002. They've updated it some since then, but the numbers were clearest back in 2002. That said 16% of Christians said they make moral choices based on the Bible. Think about that. 16% of Christians said they make moral choices based on the Bible. That means there is 84%, if I did the math right, that will maybe sometimes do it on the Bible, or do on how they feel, or a situation-to-situation basis, or whatever offers the least resistance. That's pretty scary. And we wonder why the church keeps taking steps this way, because the church is not anchored in the absolute truth of Jesus. Daniel was ultimately anchored to God. He stayed anchored to him through very challenging trials. So let me read for you from Daniel chapter 1, beginning in verse 8. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. Now, God had caused the official to show favor and sympathy to Daniel, but the official told Daniel, I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should you be looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would have my head because of you. So that's really interesting, as we're going to read the rest here in a minute. But what I find very interesting, it says God caused him to look at favor with Daniel. Daniel stood up, said, this is what I believe. And the guy's like, I can't help you. So even though God caused him to look at favor, the man said, no, I'm going to be killed if you look worse than the other young men. Just because God agrees with the direction you're headed or the stance that you're taking doesn't mean it's going to be an easy road. Daniel did not have an easy road. It might have been difficult to summon up the courage to say one time, hey, I don't want to eat this. But now he's forced to do it again. And what I love about Daniel, he doesn't whine. He doesn't throw a fit. He doesn't put an angry post on Facebook. It says this. He went to the guard, whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So there's a particular guard that oversees them directly. And he says, please. Wow. Please. I think that's pretty admirable. Please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food and treat your servants in accordance with what you see. So he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. Following God is not an easy road. It's not a simple path. It is a path that is filled with challenges along the way. And it is important that we have core convictions. And the single most core conviction we should have in life is to honor Jesus first and foremost. And so that's how you treat your family. That's how you put forth effort at work. That's how you treat your neighbor. That's how you talk to fellow church members. That's how you serve and volunteer in the church. Everything is a core conviction about your relationship with Jesus. And this ultimately leads us to the heart of the matter. Heart of the matter. The word heart actually is interesting. It comes from the word courage, which comes from the root word core, which means heart, center. So when we talk about the heart, we're not talking about these emotions that go up and down with Valentine's Day right around the corner or somebody's birthday. No, when we talk about the heart, we're talking about serious conviction. What is the center of your life? Not the emotions that are so fleeting and changing. Courage comes from what we hold dear. Why is it you see a parent sometimes throw themselves in harm's way to save a child? Because that is what they hold dear. They hold that child very near and dear to them. And ultimately in life, to honor Jesus, we might have to throw ourselves into harm's way. But we can do that if we have courage, if we have the core conviction about what truly matters. This series has been talking about endurance and how Daniel lived the life of endurance, and we can do the same. 2 words, endurance and perseverance. Endurance means the ability to withstand hardship. Perseverance is why you withstand hardship. You have to have both in life to survive. We need to live lives of endurance. So let's read the rest of the story on what happened with Daniel before we prepare to close. Daniel chapter 1, picking it up in verse 15. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine that they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. And Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. At the end of the time set before the king to bring them in, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, so they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the other magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. And Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. God honored them. They're given the choice position as officials to the king. As a slave, they did well. But sometimes, following Jesus doesn't always end that way. Sometimes it doesn't end that well. For Daniel, he remained there to the first year of King Cyrus. That would be 70 years later. So even though he had honored God, and God raised him to a high position as a slave, he would never go home. Honoring God doesn't always lead to the earthly ending we look for. And as worship team joins me on stage, it reminds me of the story from the early church. This goes to the mid-100s. I think it was 155 AD, when there was a church father named Polycarp. He was convicted to honor Jesus in all that he said and did. There was great oppression against the church in the mid-100s. It wasn't until the 300s that began to ease. So it was a tough time to be a Christian. And he was arrested by Rome and the king for being considered a traitor because he preached Jesus exclusively. And so Polycarp was taken into the Colosseum, and he was brought before a crowd and the king, and he was told to deny Jesus. He was told to condemn atheists. He was told to swear by the money that had Caesar's inscription on it. And he had no problem saying, come down to the atheists. Of course, Rome interpreted that differently than Polycarp did. And then they said, deny Jesus. And Polycarp said, 86 years have I served him faithfully, and he has done me no wrong. How could I deny or blaspheme my Savior? And so the king said, I have wild animals prepared to tear you apart. Polycarp said, that's fine. I'm not going to back down. And the king said, fine, if you're going to not be scared by them, I'm going to set you on fire. And Polycarp said, this fire will burn but an hour and will be gone. But the eternal fires of damnation will last forever. I will not deny my Savior. And so they took an 86-year-old man, they tied him to the stake. They were going to nail him. He said, you don't need to nail me. The same faith that allows me to stand here will allow me to safely go home. So they tied him without nailing him. They set the fire, and he burned. Following Jesus doesn't always give us the fairy tale happy ending. But the heart of the matter is ultimately this. The heart of the matter is Jesus promises something better one day. It might be that you have some really good days in this life, and I hope you have many of them. But ultimately, there's one day when the good days start, and they'll never end. That's what we live for. That has to be our core conviction. That's why we have to decide before we ever face a trial or difficulty. Decide to honor Jesus first. Won't you choose to do that this morning? You can do it by giving your life to Him, by putting Him first and foremost through confession, repentance, and baptism. You can recommit your life. Whatever decision you need to make, living for Jesus, one day you're going to experience just how worth it really is. Make that decision as we stand and as we sing.